And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard before this Thanksgiving. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan coming to you from the National Weather Service with your Alaska marine weather as we go into the midweek period. First, taking a look though at the development with the sea ice. The ice has become quite extensive along the Beaufort Sea coastline from Kaktovik through Utqiagvik and then down along the northwest coast. We're also seeing further ice development in through Kotzebue Sound, Norton Sounds, and then down along the coastline of the Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas. And looking at what we have coming up here on the weather map as we go through late this Tuesday night into early Wednesday morning. Low pressure system that brought significant weather to the Panhandle is going to weaken to just the trough along the northern and northeastern Gulf. But more importantly, we have the next frontal system that is attached to a low in the North Pacific south of the Aleutians. That'll be the next main weather maker. The actual low center itself will eventually head northeastward up over the eastern Aleutians on Thanksgiving Day. But out ahead of it, we have this front, and this front is going to push up and into and along the Gulf Coast by Thanksgiving Day. And this front does have a feed, a southeast to southerly feed of milder and more moist air, so it's going to result in precipitation along the Gulf Coast, also having a tendency to try to push inland a bit and may result in some wintry mix of precipitation in along areas of Cook Inlet up through the Anchorage Bowl as well as around Prince William Sound. Obviously, some of the coastal mountains here could see some moderate to locally heavier snowfalls, but this system won't be quite as big as the most recent one to come into the Panhandle. And by the time we get into Thanksgiving Thursday, the front just kind of washes out into a trough along the Alaska Peninsula on up to just inland of the Gulf Coast. So looking at winds on Wednesday for the Panhandle, look for south to southeast winds to 20 knots with waves generally running around 3-4 feet for the inner channels. For the outer nearshore waters here of the outer coast, winds will be south to southeast, 25 to 30 knots south of Gustavus, but increasing easterly west of Yakutat to 40 knots out of the east with 15-foot waves there at Cape Suckling. And then on Thursday, winds will be out of the south-southeast for the inner channels, 20 to 25 knots. There could be a gust up to 35 knots there in Lynn Canal, with waves still running generally around 4 feet. For the outer coast and the nearshore waters, look for south to southeast winds right around 25 knots, turning more toward the east by the time you get to Cape Suckling, and waves running generally around 13 to 14 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds on Wednesday will be here just outside of Hinchinbrook entrance in the northwest corner of the Gulf. Southeasterly gales 40 to 45 knots, and then we have northeast gales, lower Cook Inlet toward the entrance there at 40 knots, waves running 10 to 11 feet. For the areas off the Kenai outside of Hinchinbrook entrance, waves could be as high as 12, 13 feet. East winds within Prince William Sound and 7-foot waves. On Thursday, east winds continue within Prince William Sound at 30 knots with 7-foot waves. And as we go down here, notice the frontal system as it bumps up into along the Gulf Coast. We're going to see southeast to south winds to 20 knots, waves still upwards around 12, 13 feet. Winds will be northeast, upper middle Cook Inlet, 15 to 20 knots, but look for east to southeast winds there at the entrance of Cook Inlet and waves 6 feet. Across Kodiak Island on Wednesday, easterly winds 30 to 35 knots, waves 9 feet Shelikof Strait. As we go down the Alaska Peninsula, look for generally easterly winds 35 to 40 knot gales, waves running 11 to 12 feet on the North Pacific side and 7 to 8 feet on the Bering side. And then by the time we get into Thursday, that frontal boundary is going to be kind of draped right up along this area. So south of the front, southeasterly winds 25, 30 knots, waves 14 to 16, as high as 18 feet there south of Falls Pass. But on the other side, more easterly winds 25 to 30 knots with waves 4 to 5 feet from the Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay. Across the Aleutians, the low approaching from the south. Look for southeast to east winds 30 knots there in the eastern Aleutians. Those will turn back to the northeast and north as high as 40, 45 knots west of Kiska. Waves generally running 18 to 20 feet on the North Pacific side and anywhere from 9 to as high as 14, 16 feet on the Bering side. By the time we get into Thursday, the low circulation is here, right near the eastern Aleutians, maybe near or just west of Dutch Harbor. And we have on the backside of the low the counterclockwise circulation. Winds turn around to the northwest and increase to 40-knot gales west of Adak, waves out that way 20 feet, with lesser in the way of waves near the low center, maybe 7 feet there on the bearing side of the eastern Aleutians. For Wednesday, ahead of the frontal system, brisk east winds, 35-knot gales there. Kuskokwim, Bristol Bays, waves 5-6 feet. 35-knot east winds, St. Paul, waves 14 feet. And look for east winds out of Norton Sound, 10 knots, 2-foot waves. East-northeast winds along the Yukon Delta coastline with waves of 3 to 4 feet. By Thursday, winds still out of the east at 30 knots, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay, as well as St. Paul. Waves 5 to 6 feet there within Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays, 12 feet St. Paul. And then northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, Norton Sound to the lower Yukon Delta, waves 4 or 5 feet. And coming up to areas south of the Bering Strait on Wednesday, easterly winds 10 to 15 knots, waves generally 3 to 5 feet, just a couple of feet within Norton Sound. Winds will be southeasterly to 20 knots, lower Chukchi Sea, 4 or 5 foot waves as winds come back around to the south, southwest, 10 to 15 knots, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik with ice in place. And then on Thursday, winds across the Arctic coast will be northwest to west, 15 knots with ice in place. And dropping down through the lower Chukchi Sea, look for northeasterly winds, 15 to 20 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. And south of the Bering Strait and north side of St. Lawrence Island, look for northeasterly winds at 15 to 20 knots with waves running as from 3 feet off of Wales to as high as 7 feet on the north end of St. Lawrence.